This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, dear friends, my name is İsmail Büyükakan. I am a director of EMAR, Foundation for Labor Research. We are here to discuss the issues and concerns for Marxists raised by the events around the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The duty of Marxists in our age is to help speed up the history by conscious intervention, that is revolution. It seems quite bookish, but I should refer to Marxism even today as a pioneer idea, born before its age when the societies were not ripe enough and prepared for communism. We are face to face with many urgent and immediate problems in this capitalist capitalist world market. Ukraine or Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or Catalonia or Kurdistan or many other regional, seemingly local conflicts are among them. It is our duty to understand history, how it helped formation of today, to grasp the realities of today, and find out main trends so that we can perform our duties to working classes over the globe. That is why it is important to understand the issues, problems and opportunities for the future around what happens and around Ukraine. We in EMAR have therefore invited you, friends, and Bülent and Vasilis to our discussion. Bülent is from Kiel University, international politics professor. Vasilis is from University of East London, again international politics. He is also professor. They will speak each for about 15 minutes, then we will open discussion. Although we reserved this meeting for 3 hours, time should be regarded limited. So the first time speakers will have 5 minutes, strictly 5 minutes, and second time speakers only 3 minutes. We will also give our speakers opportunity to answer questions. We are all here to make a positive contribution to the general framework of duties of Marxists in this real world. One last thing, please keep your machines in mute while others speaking. Also introduce yourselves before speaking. Thank you very much. Now I invite Professor Bülent Gökay. Please.
Thank you, Ismail. Thank you for arranging this meeting. Like all crises, the war in Ukraine has several dimensions which need to be examined. And during the next half an hour, Vasilis and I are hoping to touch many of these important dimensions. The war in Ukraine is a reflection of the worsening inter-imperialist conflict in a multipolar world. This must be the first observation about this event. It is a reflection of worsening inter-imperialist conflict. It is a byproduct of an evolving global situation where the United States, the global hegemonic power, in a search for preserving its global hegemony. The United States has shifted its policy from the global war on terror in the 2000s to targeting sovereign nations like China and Russia, two major powers that embody particular political, economic, and military strengths. The United States government's behavior towards Russia and China are different. Different in a sense that China has now emerged as its largest economic rival, and Russia recovered from early post-Cold War chaos, both politically and militarily, and emerged powerful enough as a military-industrial complex. So the war in Ukraine is an example of how sovereign countries become launching pads, launching areas of inter-imperialist proxy wars, mainly because of their geopolitical position and their economic strength. Russia violated the territorial strength of Ukraine. In the Russian case, what we can see is a regime, both authoritarian and oligarchic, suppressing growing unrest among its citizens, rich in oil and corruption, unable to improve the lives of its citizens, while a handful of rich oligarchs getting immeasurably wealthy. Desperation has prompted the Russian leadership to declare the invasion over its neighbor, independent country, Ukraine. This is not necessarily different from the long-time wars of aggression masterminded by the United States. The 8-year limited civil war in the eastern part of Ukraine has just turned into a full-scale war. This represents a turning point in the post-Cold War era. The end of the Cold War was followed by an immense gray zone of geopolitical uncertainty. The West was celebrating their victory over the Soviet bloc. Russia, still in shock and economic chaos in early 1990s, reluctantly accepted this situation. But to understand the origins of the conflict, we need to look at that period more closely. And we need to go back and look at the decisions made by the West in that so-called New World Order in the early 1990s. First, we have to acknowledge that, but before doing this, responsibility for this current war rests with Russia and with Putin only. But that should not obscure the fact that NATO, led by the United States, laid the groundwork for confrontation with a series of mistakes and deliberate provocations since the breakup of the Soviet Union. When Vladimir Putin launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine, he effectively ended the post-Cold War era, or relative peace in the post-Cold War era. This means a deep turning point in the world order. What we are witnessing now in the current war, in many respects, a product of the processes that dissolve the power of actually existing communism in Eastern Europe and of Soviet regime. The roots of the present conflict have to be traced back to the end of the Cold War, those months, those few years in early 1990s. The last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was prepared to dismantle the Warsaw Pact and agreed that a unified Germany can be a member of NATO. And all that he asked for in return was a firm commitment that NATO would not expand eastwards. Although in those meetings, the undertaking that Gorbachev sought was not engraved in written language, meaning there wasn't an official document, official agreement. The American leaders at the meeting of that time, President Reagan and Secretary of State Baker, had given verbal assurances to Gorbachev during those meetings. As clearly demonstrated also from the American and British archival documents, which we can see now, the American leadership had indeed assured Mikhail Gorbachev with strongest terms that after German reunification, they would not allow NATO to expand to the east. Among other things, the outbreak of war in Ukraine means that we need to view the Cold War's end, this ending period, differently, through a different lens. Not the optimistic one, which a number of Western commentators, including Francis Fukuyama, celebrated as the end of history. In his final final State of Union address in 1992, then President George H.W. Bush sounded ecstatic. He said, "The biggest thing that has happened in the world in my life is, by the grace of God, America won the Cold War." And within months after the end of the Cold War, Paul Wolfowitz, Undersecretary of Defense in the US administration, issued a defense policy guidance, which said, I quote, "Our policy now must refocus on precluding the emergence of any potential future global competitor." The document further emphasized, I quote, "Russia will remain the strongest military power in Eurasia. Extraordinary efforts are therefore necessary to weaken Russia's geopolitical position permanently and irrevocably." And these also were published in New York Times in March 1992. The most important architect of this new imperial strategy was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was earlier Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. When he published his famous book, The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives, in 1997, he declared that the United States was in a position, for the first time ever, for a non-Eurasian power of becoming the paramount hegemonic power in Eurasian power relations. So for the first time, he declared the United States now as a non-Eurasian power became the paramount hegemonic power in Eurasia. In this way, he said that the United States will become the first and the last global empire. According to Brzezinski, this should be achieved, he also said this, through NATO, under United States leadership. The domination of Eurasia should be achieved through NATO. Brzezinski called this area, the post-Soviet area, or the vacuum created with the disappearance of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, as the black hole. He called this area as the black hole. And he identified Ukraine specifically as the key geopolitical pivot. He claimed that if Ukraine was incorporated into NATO framework, Russia would be irrevocably weakened. That's why he urged immediately the eastward enlargement of NATO with the final goal of incorporating Ukraine into NATO land. And this exactly happened. The presidents, Clinton onwards, all the presidents followed this advice, and they made one member after another, almost all those East European former socialist states. The United States and NATO have for 2 decades since then penetrated politically and militarily into what Russia claims as its cordon sanitaire, or it is near abroad. Russia's attempts to negotiate on this have fallen on deaf ears, completely ignored. All attempts to end the encroachment have led to nothing. NATO has moved closer and closer, recently stationing intermediate range missiles in Poland and Romania. Ukraine too is being recognized by various US administrators as a territory the United States owns. Both Yeltsin's and Putin's requests to join NATO was openly rejected. Yes, even Putin, when he became first the leader, He asked this from the NATO leaders, but all these requests were completely ignored. Washington turned to megaphone diplomacy and treated Russia as a rogue state, much like Iran, and categorically refused any negotiation on NATO expansion. This Western triumphalism following the Cold War and Putin's ultranationalism and militarism have fed on the other. One side fed the other, and they moved away from each other during this 20 years period. Russia, on the other hand, recovered from the early post-Cold War chaos. Global growth and global integration have enabled Putin's Russia to accumulate considerable power. Russia is now a strategic petrostate. Russia's foreign exchange reserve is among the largest in the world, after China, Japan, and Switzerland. Foreign exchange reserves gives the regime the capacity to withstand sanctions. But I'm sure Vasilis will talk about this in more detail. There are lots of commentaries nowadays saying that Putin has made a blunder by invading Ukraine. That remains to be seen. Putin would have predicted that NATO would become united and that sanctions would happen. Despite the fact that Russian forces seem to have failed to advance fast enough, Russia is still in the driver's seat. The idea that Putin would occupy the whole Ukraine with how many 190,000 troops is really silly. If that was the plan, he really would be mad. What is happening now is not a huge strategic change in terms of Russia's position towards Ukraine. The invasion was not in my opinion, was not a last-minute decision, was not a rushed decision. Putin is not after, or doesn't seem to be after, world domination. He is not even trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union. Putin actually has limited goals. If you listen to the news recently, again asking the same thing for the negotiations. Meaningful diplomacy, therefore, is still possible. It will require the same kind of give and take that has preserved Ukraine. Politics and international politics are complicated. But for anything to get better, we need peace negotiations to start and the fighting completely and immediately to stop. It is the crucial thing now to have a ceasefire and stop the war. Before I finish, I will say a few words about the legality, because this is always in the news recently. Of course, both the Geneva Convention and the United Nations Charter say that countries should not invade each other. And therefore, this invasion is criminal, is illegal. But who has the ability to enforce these rules? I believe it is important to say that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is illegal and criminal. Yes, I always repeat this, but enforcing the law is challenging if the power is one of the great powers. Many ongoing armed conflicts in the world demonstrated this during the last 20 years. According to UN Charter, self-defense is the only justification of using force against another country. The UN Security Council has the authority to authorize the use of force, but in this current case, it is unpractical because Russia has a permanent seat together with 4 other countries, United States, France, China, and UK. So these 5 powers, they have permanent states and they have veto power. So anything against any of these states is therefore practically impossible. The post-Second World War era witnessed many times that superpowers turn to military action when their patience runs thin. This intervention in Ukraine is 21st century imperialism. like America's invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and intervention in other places like Libya. After just yesterday, just this morning, I saw it on the news. After Russian bombs hit a theater in Mariupol, the United States President Biden has called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. I agree, Putin is a war criminal. But so are many American presidents. Therefore, I cannot help but ask this question. What has Putin done that has not been done to a greater or lesser extent by every American president since 1945? I am sure you are all familiar with the very large numbers of civilian casualties in Afghanistan and Iraq, what has came to be known as collateral damage. But even before Afghanistan and Iraq, there was serious crimes happened against humanity, even in the first year of the post-Cold War period. I just would like to finish by giving you this example. Amiria shelter bombing in Baghdad. On 13th of February 1991, the United States Air Force targeted 2 smart bombs at an air raid shelter in the Amiria suburb of Baghdad. The United States military knew that the Amiria facility had been used as a civilian defense shelter during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, but targeted it anyway, bombing it with no advance warning. About 1,500 civilians were killed. 1,500 civilians were killed in that one single bombing. According to the findings of the former United States Attorney General Ramsey Clark, people staying in the upper level were incinerated by heat, while boiling water from the shelter's water tank was responsible for many casualties. Not all died immediately. Black incinerated handprints of some victims remain fused to the concrete ceiling of the shelter and can be seen today. So yes, this is a serious war crime, and many other war crimes happened in our world. And I hope we were able to bring all these criminals to the court, but it didn't happen. And I don't think currently there's anything the world can do much to take Putin to the court. Thank you, Ismail. Ismail, your sound is off.
Thank you. Thank you, Bülent. Now it is Vasilis' turn. We are listening to you, Vasilis. Thank you.
Thanks, Ismail. Thank you so much. I have an easier task than Bülent because I'm going to talk about the consequences and I'm not going to look at whose fault is this war. I would have had problems to deal with this. But looking at the economic consequences of war, and if there is time, we can talk about a little bit about the political consequences of this war from the point of view of international relations and the redistribution of power in the global system. Now, the fashionable thing is the regime of sanctions that the United States imposed on Russia, which have no precedent. They are an unprecedented regime of sanctions, which I believe are illegal, but that's beyond the point. The regime of sanctions, I will outline very briefly the economic consequences. I have 6-7 items very briefly to talk about. But the thrust of my argument is that what the United States is doing to Russia will have negative effects both on Russia and the Western economies as well. So the damage will be collateral. Although the United States is trying to cripple the Russian economy, I think at the same time it's damaging the Western economies, especially the European ones. And the number one loser in this conflict is, I believe, Europe. So Europe has a vested interest not to align with the United States. And this historically has always been the case, what the United States has been trying to do in order to stop an alliance or an axis between Berlin and Moscow. I mean, during the Cold War, that was the case. For example, when Willy Brandt, I want to remind everybody, when Willy Brandt launched the Ostpolitik, the way the Americans stopped the Ostpolitik was by placing Persian cruise and missiles, Persian cruise missiles on German and West German soil, reminding the Germans who the main enemy is. The enemy is Russia. And anytime Russia was trying to include itself in this Western system of power, like NATO, like being a European Union, I remember Gorbachev saying in the 80s that we want Europe common house of all people. We wanted Russia to be included into the European Union. The West excluded Russia from the process as an equal member. So I'm coming to sanctions here to see the way that sanctions are working. First of all, 1/4 of all the UN members, about 41 states, are under sanctions by the United States. Now, bear this in mind, because a major weapon that the United States are using if they want to punish somebody that they consider to be an enemy. Now, so far, I mean, today I looked up the data in the morning, 380 multinational companies are moving out of Russia. I mean, from Adidas to Airbus to Disney to Delta to you name it. All these companies are moving out of Russia. So there is some 50% of assets of the Russian central bank has in its possession is no longer able to use. I mean, the central bank of Russia cannot use around 50 to 55% of its assets. I think it's about $300 billion. The total reserves are around 630 billion. So they are frozen. So overall, sanctions made the ruble fall a lot. So the currency is very much depreciated. So there is inflation. Bear this in mind, because we're going to be having inflation here, and we will see why. So in terms of Russian debt, Russia that does not have an enormous public debt is very small. It's about, we're talking about state bonds, for example. They're not much. It's not much. It's about 17% of its GDP. Russia has private debt. It's about 200 billion. Now, here is the bet for Putin. Putin says to the companies that are leaving Russia right now, he says to them, if you want to go, you're free to go, but come back in 3 months, because if you don't come back within 3 months, then whatever I owe you because you're leaving, you're going to be paid in rubles, in a depreciated currency. So that would mean default. That's why you see in the news that Russia may be defaulting. But who cares if Russia defaults? It's not Spain or Greece. It's a sovereign state. There's a central bank. It will print rubles, a depreciated currency. It doesn't matter. I don't think it matters much. Let me put it this way, if Russia defaults. Now, then another consequence of this, of the sanctions, is that Russia is trying to persuade India and China to get together to create an international payment system, international but Eurasian-based payment system, because Russia is being kicked out of the SWIFT, right? There is a name, I forgot, it doesn't come to my mind. There is a name to that, Russia. Now, I think although this is well below the capacity and the volume of money that goes through that system, compared to the West, it's still the beginning. That if this goes ahead, then it's gonna deal a severe blow to the dollar-based Western economies. Now, one problem with the system of the alternative to the dollar system is that China has capital controls. And if a country has capital controls, cannot develop a very healthy, I'm always from a capitalist perspective, right? A very healthy bond market. So these are an issue between Russia and China has to be sorted. I'm coming to the second major consequence of this war. And I think it undermines the confidence of investors to the dollar as a global reserve currency. If you look at the pattern of the United Nations vote in the UN Assembly, you will see that most states that were neutral to the conflict, that were they were outside of NATO, of course, but there were also states that belonged. There were either under the influence of China and Russia, or there were petroleum states, petro states, Gulf states. They supported Russia. They kept neutral. Now the reason is because of these. They have so much. They hold so much American debt. They have so much, the treasury bills. They have a lot of money invested in U.S. treasury bills. And they think that, look, I mean, if whatever happens in the world and they have a peculiar political position, America has the power to freeze all these assets they're holding outside their jurisdiction. So they are thinking seriously of diversifying, for example, and instead of having Saudi Arabia with their petrodollars investing in a treasury bill, in U.S. treasury bills, to invest in a Chinese digital currency, like the renminbi. They can invest even in Bitcoin, wherever, you name it. You know how many speculators are out there nowadays as we speak, when there is a crisis of the dollar, a crisis of the major global reserve currency. The third consequence now, and I'm coming now to how much we are going to suffer in the West. It's related to the energy sector. It's so obvious, right? I mean, you read Financial Times, you will see. I mean, 30% of crude oil is supplied via pipeline to Europe from Russia. Okay, I mean, Germany resists to stopping a number of pipelines that bring crude oil and gas to Germany, Slovakia, Poland, and other European countries. So there is, for example, I was reading recently the so-called friendship pipeline that brings Russian crude to Germany since 1952. The Germans did not stop this pipeline, and there is a major conflict. Of course, we don't see it. They're not going to tell us that there is major conflict between the German state and the American state over this. I don't think Germany supports this war between me and you. I don't believe that the German state supports this war. There is a rift between the US and the European Union, and I believe at this stage, if European Union can really mediate and find a solution to the conflict that keeps Ukraine permanently neutral, never become a member of NATO, then Putin would have no reason whatsoever to stay in Ukraine. No reason whatsoever, and we all should force him to pay for the havoc it created to Ukrainian society. I see as another consequence of the war is that it precipitates the demographic crisis of Eastern Europe. The demographic crisis. I mean, how many people are going to leave Ukraine now? 3-4 million? There are already refugees. Poland has almost 2 million refugees. Brain drain continues and precipitates in these war conditions. We talked earlier Ismail, about military spending. Yes, it increases military spending. Defense budget increases. Germany increased its military budget, and if you like, this was one of America's major aims before the war for decades, that each NATO partner should spend more than 2% of its GDP to for their own defense, contributing to overall NATO obligations, their NATO obligations, 2%. So Germany now exceeded that. It's going to be more than 2% of its GDP. China is also increasing its military spending. I checked the data, by 7.1% of its GDP. It was 6.8% the year before. So yes, military defense spending increases. And today, Biden signed a decree to send 1 billion more military equipment to Ukraine. Apparently, the West is supporting the war in that respect, and it supports, it backs up Ukrainian regime. The Ukrainian regime, Bulen talked a lot about the authoritarianism of Putin. We all agree, but I don't want anybody to believe that Ukraine's regime was democratic. For God's sake, not at all. I mean, it was a puppet of the IMF. I mean, in order for Russia to keep Ukraine under Russian influence, they let them go away with their debt, but then it didn't work in 2014, and we know all that what happened at that time. So conclude, or rather, before I conclude, one more point I want to make: the West will suffer also because Ukraine, both Ukraine and Russia, are major exporters of grain, of sunflower oil, of fertilizers, and rare earth elements. And because of this, because of all of this, there is going to be a major food crisis in the third world. The third world will suffer. And we're going to suffer here because, and I'm coming now to full circle, to argue, and this is my main position really, that continuation of the war will cripple the Western economies as much as it will cripple Russia, who will be trying to find a solution to its problems through China and India. But at the same time, here we're going to suffer. And if there is not de-escalation and a solution to this war, inflation here will skyrocket. And if inflation skyrockets, interest rates will keep going up and up and up. And if interest rates keep going up and up and up, there will be an impact on growth, because there'll be the rate of investment will fall. So we're going to be back to the 70s stagflation, which means stagnation accompanied by high inflation. And I'll stop here. I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasilis. Before I give room to any questions, I would just like to tell you that Financial Times published an article of Sarah O'Connor on 15th of March, where she says Europe has done the right thing by allowing Ukrainian refugees to work. She tells us that usually they ban all the refugees from working, but for Ukrainians specifically and specially, they give right to work with temporary protection, immediately effective. So Ukrainians, according to her, will now be able to move around the European Union to where they have family support and better employment prospects. Many asylum seekers haven't been given such rights at all. And there are deficits in agriculture, transport, and construction, for example, in the UK. So I believe that when Ukrainians, refugees, come here, the agricultural problems will be lessened because of the cheap and fresh labor. And the same with the transport, lots of drivers will come, and construction. This is what happens, what will happen, what may happen in the UK. The same thing happens in Hungary. Hungary has already let, and Poland has already let hundreds, maybe thousands of Ukrainians to work in their markets. So this is one of the results European Union makes benefit out of a war. Okay, are there any questions? Are there anything to add? Rajmil, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, I will unmute myself. Hi, I need to also hit the camera, right? 1 second. Yes, yeah, I know the camera is doing something funny because it was covered. I'm Fishman. I'm from Kiel University. I'm a musician, but as Roland knows, I'm very interested in geopolitics. So that's my background. There's millions of questions, but probably the most burning one is whether, I think you both mentioned changes, both Vasilis and Bulent, regarding the situation in the world. And the question is whether you think this is a sort of historical moment where what people have been talking about for years and years, which is the decay of the unipolar Western world and economy and the dollar, of course, is going to finally accelerate. Is this just a blip, or is this the thing that is going to precipitate? And you already mentioned the alternatives between the foreign exchange between China, India, and Russia, and the way Russia has been preparing to be self-sufficient against sanctions. So on the one hand, we see that. On the other hand, we see that the Western world has become a lot more authoritarian. It's the first time in my lifetime that I can see proper censorship in as good as the Soviet Union would do with any information which didn't go to the narrative of the West. So we see a radicalization and a separation at the same time. So please comment on that.
Yes, who will comment on that? Bülent?
Thank you, Rahmil. This is a really important question. I think this is a return to the seemingly cold, hot war imperialist paradigm of the past, where only a few superpowers, only a few global hegemonic powers decide about the future of smaller nations and peoples. I think we saw this first in Syria, a small version of this. There was the major standoff between superpowers around the proxy war in Syria. Now, with the Ukraine, it became much more obvious. And I just want to end this comment by saying that this is in line with what Vasilis and I have been writing for the last 20 years. We are in the interregnum period. This is the transition period from one major hegemonic structure is declining and other powers emerging, but they are not powerful or unified enough to replace that system. And in this interregnum, just like Gramsci mentioned in the 1930s, a number of morbid symptoms emerge. So one of the most dangerous morbid symptoms is this: returning to a paradigm where only a few superpowers decide the future of the world, future of the smaller nations. Thank you.
Can I also say something before continuing forward. I have read something about what Henry Kissinger has said. He is a very interesting man. So there are contradictions in the American behavior as well. There is this Monroe Doctrine, which tells that there should be nobody else rivaling America around American interests. But on the other hand, Kissinger says this: if Ukraine is, he says that in 2014, if Ukraine is to survive and thrive, it must not be either side's outpost against the other. It should function as a bridge between them. The West must understand that to Russia, Ukraine can never be just a foreign country. Even such famed dissidents as Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Joseph Brodsky insisted that Ukraine was an integral part of Russian history and indeed of Russia. Ukraine should not join NATO. That is what Kissinger said. But on the other hand, Monroe Doctrine says that there shouldn't be any rivals against American hegemony. Are there any questions? Okay. Ali, unmute yourself, please.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ali. I am from a refugee and migrant forum in Faro, Hackney. And in Hackney, there are more than 100 languages spoken. You can find many people from different parts of the world, and sort of springboard for the individuals to come to Hackney, to find people from their own countries, learn about the system and the opportunities, and start working or find their other people to together for new opportunities. Especially last decade, many crises happened, as you know, like Syrian issue, Afghanistan issue. Obviously, people start coming from those countries, and also the local council promised to do something, and they contact us as well. What can we do? But never they fulfill their promises to help these people. For example, they promised to open 25 houses for the Syrian refugees, but they open only 7 because of us pressurize them. Also, Afghani people, they put them in a hotel in unbelievable, terrible conditions, and forget about it. But as soon as this Ukrainian crisis started, and refugees about to come to London or our borough, we start receiving emails, telephone calls, what you are going to do, what will happen now, and how can you help them? And we are going to do this because suddenly things changed. When I see the news about African students in Ukraine trying to escape from the war, and they're waiting for their turn to cross Poland, and they were always pushing them back because of color of the skin, religion. Also, they are simply from Africa. Same as London. Suddenly, this white people, they start coming to London and other part of Britain. Different attitude, different approach to the matter. That's why I'd like to ask if other colleagues and comrades witness such things in their boroughs, in their places. This shows how the hypocrisy and racism, institutionalized racism in this society to expose for the others. Also, I just would like to learn about the opinions, Bülent and Vasily, the domino effects, because when the countries start losing in the wars, they want other communities, other countries involved in the war, and it will open kind of reason of the biggest catastrophe and loss of lives. That's why this is very important as well, because now I see the news, they are asking about involvement of China, what they think, and they are forcing people to take a side. And as Marxists, we know this is two imperialist countries trying to get rid of each other's to get the biggest areas to continue exploit. And in this fight between America and Russia, Ukraine became a kind of piece of meat, and they are trying to grab pieces from out of this meat. And these two questions, one in attitude to refugees different than the other refugees from different countries, and domino effect may cause much more serious problems in the world.
Bülent or Vasilis, which one of you will answer to these questions?
Bülent, you want to go?
You start and I can continue because I started first. You don't go, you know.
The different attitudes towards refugees is something that puzzles me myself. Obviously there is a humanitarian issue here, a humanitarian issue, and they need to address it. You have, you know, population moving across borders, and they have to address that issue immediately. I think that is perhaps the explanation I can think of at the moment, but it puzzles me a little. It puzzles me. It's correct. Now, as regards the domino effect, I couldn't understand well, Sabine. What do you mean the domino effect of Ukraine spilling over and having a nuclear war, or something? Is that what you mean? Okay, I think they're sensible enough not to do all these stupid things. But as I said earlier on, Biden is financing this war, is financing Zelensky regime in Ukraine. So if they may be doing it because they are currently negotiating, so therefore whoever has better position on the ground will achieve the better negotiating settlement. It is the logic of the connection between the operational side and the political diplomatic side. So this has always been the case. But the more this goes on, the more economically both sides will suffer. One thing I want to add is that, and this is the result of a paper I'm working on with a couple of other people. Bülent read it, and is that Putin's strategy that has been approved by Duma, the national strategy, is the protection of the Russian minorities living outside the borders of the Russian state that resulted after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because there are Russian minorities everywhere, in Central Asia, in the Baltic states, there are across around the borders of Russia. So he used that as an excuse. Don't take me wrong, but it's a strategy that they say, as Bülent said earlier, many people use that in the past. You know, I mean, the United States intervened to protect the Albanians of Kosovo from Milosevic's, brutal treatment of Albanians, Kosovo, and so on and so forth. That is a very important element, and the strategy that the legal argument is is also interesting. The Russians invoked 51, Article 51 of the UN Charter. I don't think it makes any sense. But if you see the way they invade, personally, more of a policing operation rather than an invasion, a full-scale invasion, where you use artillery, you use the air force, and you effectively you create havoc everywhere. You bomb strategic. I don't think the Russians did that. It reminds me of a policing operation. And I think they did that because they do not want to alienate a large part of the population that can tolerate Russians, so they are pro-Russians themselves. I don't think they went into Ukraine just for indiscriminate killing, you know? And we have, of course, to mention the thousands of mercenaries the West sends to Ukraine to create a mess there and blame the Russians. So it's a lot of things going on there we don't know. That is my understanding of the situation. I don't think there is anybody an angel. There are no angels, but I think the West is putting a lot of oil into the fire and creates more mess.
Thank you, Vasilis. Bülent, what about China?
Can I say first a few words about what Aliza asked on the refugees migration? My friend Faro, who's here now, she's teaching a master course in Kiel on refugee law, migration law. And I was teaching a session just yesterday in that program. And more than half of the session, we talked about these double standards we are witnessing every day in the media. It is really almost like we went back to 1950s. So it is not only the ordinary citizens, it is the people, presenters from BBC to Al Jazeera, even Al Jazeera, they are presenting that these are not like refugees we are used to from Afghanistan or Libya or Iraq. These are white people. These are people who live like us, who can be your next door neighbor. These are all educated people. These are all people like us. They are, and many people repeated this, they are people with blue eyes and blonde. So can you imagine in the 21st century, all those educated people, they are presenters, and even the politicians, for instance, Bulgarian prime minister used the same language, saying that these are white European people. Therefore, we have to do something to protect them. But just imagine all those things Aliza mentioned about, and Ismail, you mentioned too, how the European countries open their arms to Ukrainian refugees, which is good. I am glad that they are looking after these refugees. But this gives us the opportunity to compare their behavior just until this Ukrainian war. How was the refugee issue in Europe? How was the refugee issue here? Just since 2015, more than 10,000 refugees drowned and died in the sea, either trying to cross from Libya to Italy or coming from Turkey and Greece. And one person, an Italian captain, that woman who was trying to help them, and she saved many refugees from drowning, despite the government said that don't save them, don't go help them. And she was taken to the court, and they wanted to put her in prison for 10 years. So, this is really serious. And one reason of this is, of course, proximity, and this is next door, and they are more familiar Ukrainian people. But underlying all these, and all this language used, like blue eyes, blonde people, white people, it is pure and direct racism. It is white racism, despite everything. Despite all those claims that we moved away from that level of racism, it seems it is still there, just came to the surface with the recent situation.
I was also asking you about the China.
Well, China is in a very difficult position right now. I mean, China doesn't want to see a war, doesn't want to be even associated with a party in the war. Their policy since the end of the Cold War, even before, was expanding their trade and improving their industry and the living standards of their citizens. And this is happening regularly for China. China has no interest in being part of this war. But at the same time, China and Russia recently moved closer to each other, both economically and militarily. And therefore, China cannot just leave Russia to be dealt by the Western powers. But at the same time, China doesn't want to be part of this conflict. I think they are trying to be an intermediary. They are trying to play an important role to bring the peace. Ismail, I think Faro wanted to talk earlier.
I will give Faro the word. Faro.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your contributions. Yes, my name is Furu, and I'm a lecturer in law from Kiel University, and my interest is international refugee law. Just to second everything that I've heard and comment on what Bulent was saying, and also I think, was it Mr. Ali? I can't remember now. But inherently, the 1951 Refugee Convention was drafted with the view of European refugees, and now we can see that how after 360-degree turn, it really shows again that inherently it's such a racist, colonial sort of, international treaty. And another point is that it always has been thinking about the country of origin as the persecutor, right? And when Iraq and Afghanistan were invaded by West, the European Union needed to come up with a new law to allow those refugees fleeing the war, because the war was actually created, and the invasion and the persecution and risk to life was created by the actual invaders. So the European Union came up with a qualification directive called 2004 directive. But it's very interesting, and again, obviously, given my research interest, I, of course, all refugees deserve protection. But now calling Ukrainians refugee actually is against what the 1951 refugee has been implemented, and how the European Union used the 2004 directive to come up with an exception that we called where we could welcome Afghan people, refugees from Afghanistan and Iraq. And again, this is just coming back to that double standard, and it's just a fine example, and unfortunately, but such a clear example of double standard and racist nature of accepting refugees. And the last point is about external causes of refugee flow. I can recall a United Nations High Commissioner's refugee report. So this is the agency created after the 1951 Refugee Convention. in its 1999 report, it actually does confirm that sanctions against Iraqi people and sanction against the government of Saddam Hussein created refugees. So that was the first time that UN was saying that, look, when you impose sanctions, it's people who suffer. But on that note, I'm very grateful for all the contributions. And I have always viewed law, international refugee law, which is my interest, but it is such a close relation it has with foreign policy, war, international relation, and we can never look at refugees in isolation or refugee law in isolation. So although my background is law and I'm an advocate. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there. Thank you everyone.
Thank you for all.
Can I say something?
I will give you a word, Vasilis. Just give me a second. To Faro, I have seen a couple of days ago an article in the New York Times which compares two different refugees treated by Polish authorities. One is from Belarusia, and he is from either Afghanistan or any Eastern country. It is a recent case. One is from Ukraine. They are more or less at the same border. The one from Belarusia is still being rejected, because he is not regarded as refugee. He is an economic migrant, so he is not allowed, definitely. But the Ukrainian, he immediately comes. This is a New York Times article. I would recommend you to read that.
Thank
Okay,
you.
okay, Vasilis.
Okay, I'm even more puzzled now with the issue of refugees, and I'll tell you why. Assume that instead of having 45 million Ukrainians living in Ukraine, blondie or blue eyes or whatever, you had 45 million Hindus, dark skin or from Pakistan or you name it. Now, if I subscribe 100% to the argument of racism, which I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I think there is discrimination. There is a substratum of racism. I'm absolutely certain about that. But I am of the opinion that what prevails in Western minds is a strategic element, the geostrategic element. So if, for example, take the example of Bosnia. Who the West sided with in Bosnia? They sided with the Muslims of Bosnia, although the first that were ethnically cleansed were the Serbs of Krajina. The West didn't lift a finger to protect the Serbs of Krajina in Croatia. 13% they were exterminated overnight. The first, and then Srebrenica came. But Srebrenica has become a big thing. The Serbs of Krajina, nobody even knows. I'm even mentioning this, and I'm saying that people don't know that they were massacred there by Croats, right? But people don't say this. It is not the strategic interest of the West. So I'm thinking perhaps we need to think here how the Western minds think first, and then of course there is a race. I'm not underestimating it at all. But don't think it's of primary importance in the strategic calculations as regards Ukraine, as it was the case in Bosnia, for example, when they supported the Muslim element there against the Serbs. The Serbs are Slavs, the Ukrainians are Slavs, the same people. I mean, I remember when I was reading, and Bulen can confirm that, when I was reading Lenin and all that, and the Russian populists, 19th century literature and stuff about the Russian populists, they were all these people around Ukraine and the Balkans, they're called Southern Slavs. The populists of Southern Slavs, the Narodniks, they were supporting the unification of the entire Slavic nation. That was the Narodnik element that Lenin debated with and so on. Lenin was a Narodnik, by the way, as well. That's what I wanted to say. You know, there is discrimination, but I believe that if we had placed there Pakistanis in Ukraine, they will be all welcome because of the, you know, because they're anti-Russians. This is that's my take, and that's my understanding. But thank you for making me understand this point, because I was puzzled. I was really puzzled with this.
Okay, thank you, Vasilis. I would just like to remind you all that Ukraine is not a religiously uniform country. Western Ukraine are Catholics. Eastern Ukraine, and mostly the Russian speakers of Ukraine, they are Orthodox. So there is a interreligious thing going on there as well. But what I want to ask you is something else. We know that there is something called right to self-determination. It is, as far as I know, I learned, it is a universal right. However reactionary or bourgeois it may be, it is a right. So there was the Ukrainian issue of Ukrainian self-determination in June 1917. The Ukrainians wanted to determine their own fate, and the Russian government said no. And there is a famous article by Lenin
You send it.
defending the Ukrainians' self-determination right. What Putin attacks is actually Lenin there, accepting, recognizing the right to self-determination. For me, at the very end, right to self-determination of world proletariat is the answer. But I wouldn't refuse right to self-determination of nations. Like, for example, Lenin has recognized the Finland. Finland could go away, so they seceded from the Russia. They became an independent country and a reactionary country indeed. Before the Second World War, they had war with Russia, Soviet Russia. So Ukrainians' right to self-determination has been attacked here as well by the invasion of Russia. What do you think about this, Bülent?
Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, of course, I agree with you. I think it doesn't matter what kind of regime in a country. I mean, the self-determination and also United Nations Security Council, Security Charter recognizes this. This is the only time using force is acceptable. And therefore, Ukrainians are defending their own country. It doesn't matter whether they are from the same political inclination with me or not. They are defending themselves, and this is their right. And in that sense, I support them. But I think this also brings another issue, which is quite important to many of us, because we know that among the left-wing movements in the world, there is a debate going on about this war, how to treat Russia, how to interpret, how to explain the Russian behavior. I think, in my opinion, with this war on Ukraine, Russia's ideological scream, I mean, presenting itself as an inheritor of the socialist, anti-imperialist, anti-fascist struggle has finally disappeared. So they cannot claim that they have anything to do with the Second World War anti-fascist defense tradition anymore. Putin, look at Putin. When we look at the Putin closely, he doesn't offer any kind of promise, any kind of positive promise, or even an image of a better world. He's not even a social democratic image. He doesn't offer. He offers an image of a world dominated by oligarchic interests, a world of KGB capitalism. Putin became Putin by first leveling Grozny against the Chechens. Those of you who followed the events in 1999, the second Chechen war, it was horrible. I mean, if we consider the bombing of Ukraine is really tragic and horrible, comparing with this, I mean, Grozny was bombarded and everything, every single building was completely damaged. And majority of the population either died or escaped. Only a handful of fighters remained in Grozny. So Putin tried the same tactic in Chechnya first. And then in his rise to power, re-establishing central state apparatus in Russia according to his own vision, and first of all targeting all the oligarchs, eliminating the ones who didn't agree with him. He created almost like a gangster capitalism. This is what he represents. He doesn't represent anything positive. He represents a state actively working for making a handful of oligarchs richer and richer, and oppressing and suppressing everybody else who even has slight criticism of this regime. Thank you.
Can we add that all over the world there is this neoliberal stage of capitalism, which actually Etienne Balibar calls pure capitalism. If you leave it without class struggle, that is what bourgeoisie is capable of doing. Now, neoliberalism is not associated with parliamentary democracy. Why? Because it needs free hands, no borders, no bureaucracy in front of capitalism. And any parliamentary democracy is actually bringing lots of rules. So executive power is more useful for neoliberal policies. What do you think about this, Vasilis? You are on mute.
I think first we need to clarify the self-determination. You are right. There is this point of view you said, the self-determination of the working class. And this is a very, very prominent position, especially in the thinking of Bukharin. And Bukharin disagreed with Lenin on this. Then we go to the Leninist position of self-determination, which was different from that of Wilson, the American president, who talked about self-determination as well. So Lenin, in opposition to Wilson, was saying that self-determination for people who are a minority within a majority. For example, if the Russians in eastern Ukraine want to declare self-determination and unite with the Russian state, they have the right to do so. That was Lenin's position. Similarly, if the Turks in Turkish Cypriot, the Cypriots, want to declare self-determination and unite with Turkey, they have the right to do so. That's the Leninist position. It's not Denktaş's position. That was Lenin's position. Now Wilson was saying, no, so that the majority prevails over the minority. That's the bourgeois. Now you tell me now, if we implement Lenin's position, what is going to happen around the world? You tell me how many wars are you going to have? You have probably global war with flashpoints everywhere. Everywhere. including Turkey, of course, including the Caucasus, Central Asia, in the Baltic states. Everywhere, every state has a minority inside. What are you going to do? Create hundreds of states and then unite? I mean, in Cyprus, before 74, you didn't even have the Muslims, the Turks in one place. They were all mixed, lived together. How can you have two states on Cyprus? I mean, you see, now you can, but I mean, you see, this is a very, very difficult problem. I personally believe that the states should not be broken up. I don't believe that as they are, let them all prosper and let's create larger communities, even get rid of the states we have. We don't need more states. We need fewer states. That's how I see the world. I mean, that's my understanding of self-determination. If you implement it, that's why Lenin, in fact, I'm not sure that he really implemented his own conception of self-determination. I'm not sure. He wanted the wheat of Ukraine, and he got it. He wanted the wheat of Ukraine. So without the wheat of Ukraine, we cannot survive. Or without the oil of Baku, we cannot survive as a state. That's a Bolshevik state. He was saying this. I mean, what self-determination did he give to Azerbaijanis? What self-determination did he give Lenin? I mean, he had his own Bolshevik party and was ruling through the Bolshevik party, saying we are. You see what I'm saying? I'm not sure. I mean, he did it, what he promised, really.
Key here is voluntary unity. That is the key.
Yes, in when you say it is nice, but when it's in practice, voluntary, you know, and you have people saying this is my land and who are you, and you know, making money out of oil, and I have my own bureaucracy here. I mean, it's complex. It's complex. Let the states be as they are. I'm against the invasion because of this, because you cannot say because you have 17% Russians in Ukraine, you have the right to invade Ukraine. That's why I'm against this, effectively. You break up a state. You break up a state, you create a mess. I understand all the justifications, of course, NATO expansion, I understand all that. But, you know, try to sort it out through the UN Security Council. Try to sort it out through the UN Security Council. Bring all these documents that Bülent was mentioning about the meetings, Gorbachev. I found those as well. The Guardian published it, I think. I have them somewhere stored in my files. You know, of course. So that self-determination is still not resolved. I mean, in people's minds and in my mind, but as things are, I'm not sure that I would support Lenin's definition of self-determination. In practice, I don't think it works now. I don't think it works. It will create a mess. Yugoslavia, Bosnia, they created the Bosnian state. Do you think there is, what's going on in Bosnia today? Who is self-determined there? I mean, they are everywhere mixed. Sarajevo, there is East Sarajevo, there is University of East Sarajevo, there is a Serbian enclave. There's totally segregated. The more you create self-determination, according to Lenin, the more little places will say. All you think Montenegro qualifies as a state. They have to have some attributes to have a state. Montenegro is qualified. I mean, there are 37% Serbs in Montenegro. Are they going to declare self-determination? This is how it is in practice. It's ridiculous. These states are geopolitical constructions in favor of supporting the West. The West wanted to have Bosnia, and we got Bosnia. That's it. And Germany. And basically, America wanted to have Bosnia there in order to stop Germany's Drachna hosting. It's different. It's more complex. I mean, I don't know. What was the other question, Ismail? Sorry. It went on and on.
You have talked so much, I could not remember.
I don't know. You said the question something about imperialism. This is the issue of imperialism, whether Russia is an imperialist state and what kind of imperialism.
For Marxists,
Yeah.
There are actually several important issues. One of them here is the character of Russia.
Yeah.
For me, I am quite, how do you say, I'm quite relieved to admit that with this invasion of Ukraine, the last emotional straw between communists and Russia is gone. So I feel in that way freer because think about London. London is where Marx have worked. It has no significance for us. Paris, where Paris Commune has happened, it has no significance for us either. And Berlin, for example, Berlin has had lots of revolutions. Rosa was there, Red Rosa, but it doesn't have that big significance. And Russia has had the October Revolution and delivered it back. It became bourgeois Russia. So for me now, I am free in that way, maybe much poorer, but free, because then I can decide much better for the class issues. Working classes everywhere, regardless of their religion, their nationality, and so on. But of course, there are lots of other issues, and not everybody is agreeing. In Russia today, the biggest communist party, Russian Federation Communist Party, supports the invasion and gives full support to Putin. And the main trade union supports Putin. But the other communist parties, there are lots of other opposing socialists who don't agree with Putin, and there is at least one big workers' union not supporting Putin. So the class positions are quite different. It can happen here and there, but we should search for the search for the information about what's happening where. I don't hear much about Russia these days because my television doesn't give Russian television Russia Today channel at all. This is Western democracy, so I'm not allowed to watch RT. There are many other issues. Okay, before talking too much, I will give word to anybody who wants to contribute or ask questions. If not, I will just continue.
I'd like to make a comment. Hello.
Please, Lily, carry on.
So, I'm Lily Hamziado, and I work at Birmingham City University, and I also work for Iraq Body Count, the NGO. And I just want to share with you something that I heard today. So I asked my class, would you take in an Ukrainian refugee? And they all said yes. Then I asked, would they take in a refugee from Afghanistan, Syria, or Iraq? And they all said no. And I would say about half of my class are Muslims, and they wouldn't take a refugee from the Middle East. So I said, why is that? And they said, because they could be a terrorist. So it was interesting to me that they see the Ukrainian refugees purely as victims, whereas the Middle Eastern ones as possible aggressors, not necessarily as victims. And I also understood why, when I speak of another invasion, that of Iraq, and the casualties of that, they're not that interested. But they're very interested in the casualties now in Ukraine. They know the specific latest number that was reported. And that puzzled me. I was not expecting the whole class to speak with one voice on this. And I'm just wondering if this is because, as Ismail was saying, this is what they hear primarily. This is what they hear through the media, and they're not allowed to hear anything else. So that's my comment. Ismail, if you're speaking, you need to unmute yourself.
Robin, yes.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank Bülent and Vasilis for their incisive contribution to which I think we all recognise is quite a turning point in world history. And from the point of view of Marxism, I don't know whether everybody here is a Marxist, but I certainly am, and certainly the invites, talked about Marxist theory and the relevance of Marxist theory to this new crisis. I'd like to just make some very bland comments, really, about where I think Marxist theory has got to. And I think at the moment, we need, as Marxists, I think Marxists really do need to rethink their understanding of the world and certainly of history. Because I think certainly if you look at what's happened over the last 40 years, the official communist movement now is bankrupt, really. I mean, Ishmael mentioned the Russian Federation Communist Party is supporting Putin. And, there's no real movement there in the official communist movement at all in terms of theory. They've developed very good theories in part over the last 150 years. And I think one of the most inspiring contributions to Marxist theory was Marx's 1859 contribution, his preface contribution, where he talks about forces of production coming into conflict with social superstructure and all the rest of it, and opening up a whole era of social revolution. The weakness of that paraphrase, I mean, it's very philosophical and it's very inspiring, but he couldn't really point to that era of social revolution. I think in Marx's own mind, what he was thinking back to was the 1848 revolutions, which were quite exceptional, really. And at the time, he was trying to underpin why those revolutions happened in terms of economic developments, which is then sparked his whole research into capitalism itself and publishing Capital. But he could never really point to that social era of revolution. And to me, the first time that you could really pinpoint such an era where really the class forces had actually developed the means of production as far as they could, but then failed to do that. And that was really the whole crisis from 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War. And from that, I think there was some major developments in terms of theory. I think Lenin's book on imperialism was a major step forward. But the problem with all Marxist theory is because Marxists themselves are partisans and want to get involved in the practicalities of bringing about revolution, I think often they lose sight of their theory and they start drifting into wishful thinking. And I think Lenin and the official communist movement really got into wishful thinking that from 1914 onwards, it was really about capitalism being moribund and being overtaken and replaced by socialism. And the official communist movement carried that on for a long time until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And really all this sort of theoretical views of the official communist movement really disintegrated. They couldn't explain why the Soviet Union and communism collapsed. They can't really explain what's going on in China. Lots of people still think China is still socialist. I don't. I don't think it is. I don't think it was ever a time, from 1914 onwards, ever a time about socialism replacing capitalism, because I think the evidence shows that capitalism still had a lot of life in it, and it developed a lot further and proved that it actually was far more powerful than its opponents in Russia and China and elsewhere, and Cuba. And one of the main problems of all socialist experiments in the third world is it always had to confront this superior force of capitalism that wouldn't allow them to really develop democracy, genuine democracy, beyond a certain point. Because if they did, like in Cuba, if Cuba had seriously allowed to develop freedom and democracy in Cuba, Cuba would have been destroyed as a social experiment. It would have been overtaken by America. And the problem with Russia is always that it could never go beyond a certain point. So I really want to say, what does this latest invasion by Russia into Ukraine, what does it signify? I think it signifies a new general crisis. And what I mean by that is a crisis like the one that happened between 1914 and was resolved in 1945. The official communist movement recognized there was a general crisis during those times, but then they just got involved in wishful thinking. And like with Stalin, he actually started to talk about the general crisis continuing after 1945 and going through different phases where eventually socialism in the Soviet Union would overtake the West and all the rest of it. You know, it was just baloney. And I think we've now entered a period of general crisis which will last for 30 years. Russia now is a pariah state. Even if this war is resolved, it will not remove the fact that the world will not trust Russia again. And so long as Putin is in charge, or the oligarchs are in charge, Russia will remain a pariah state. And to a large extent, the West will pursue the point where it can actually disarm Russia. And we're living in a very dangerous time where Third World War can break out at any time. They talk about the Cuba crisis being near to Third World War. I don't believe that. I don't think it ever was. It was frightening, but I don't think America or Russia ever had their backs against the wall where they would allow that to break out into a Third World War. Today, we are dangerously close to a Third World War. The only thing I can thank Biden and the West for at home is the fact they resisted these calls for a no-fly zone, which I think would guarantee Third World War. Unfortunately, that is the state of the matter. No matter how much we'd like to help Ukraine resist Russian aggression, we are dangerously close to Third World War. However, Russia is still not the major player. China is the real force, really. It's like in 1914, it was Germany was the main contender for Britain and America. And the main problem was Britain's dominance of the world system with its empire and all the rest of it. And it's only after British hegemony was destroyed and removed by America that a new phase of capitalism was allowed to emerge. This time around, we've got to decide what is the significance of this new phase, this new, I think somebody mentioned new stages. I think we are entering a new stage, but what is the significance of this new stage? Is it where capitalism is going through to a higher level, as it was, I believe, in 1914? It was actually a transition to a higher stage of capitalism. Or are we talking about a phase now where we're going into a new stage where basically capitalism is in terminal decline? And for the first time, we are really talking about the conditions for replacing capitalism as a system. In which case, I think the communists and Marxists should have a lot more optimism about what could happen this time. I think there is a genuine, I think Russia in particular, I think the conditions there now offer social revolution. Russia is going to go into a severe economic crisis. And I think the population there's possibly good conditions there for a social movement to develop, which will possibly overthrow Putin and his system. The West won't like it. The West won't want Putin replaced by something else that is possibly democratic or socialistic. They will want to walk in and replace Putin's regime with another regime of their own liking. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you. I will just read the full paragraph there which you mentioned from Marx. In the preface to the Critique of Political Economy, he says, "No social order ever perishes before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have developed, and the new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society." Theoretically, you may say capitalism is in decline, but on the other hand, practically whole of Latin America, whole continent of Africa is at the first or second stages of capitalism. So there are lots of things to do under capitalism all over the world. But we may talk about the imperialist redivision of the world market. That is a very real reality. That is very real. In Africa, everywhere, Chinese capital is fighting against the American or Europeans. Everywhere. Even in Latin America, China invests everywhere where Americans are getting really irritated, because there is Chinese presence in Bolivia, Peru, everywhere. So this means that the competition or fight for hegemony between China and America will continue quite a lot, quite a long time. But there is also a moment that nuclear weapons may be used. We know today that during Second World War, after Second World War, during the Korean War in 1951, Americans have regarded of using at least 60 atomic bombs on China. We know that America is one and only nuclear criminal country in the world, because they have thrown the second bomb to Nagasaki just to warn the Russians who were driving to Berlin. Be careful. Don't go forward. Don't go anywhere. You risk of being bombed. That was the message. I am not talking about hearsay. There are documents among the between the American different departments about this discussion. So we know also that during 1961 crisis, Americans have taken into consideration bombing at least 260 Russian places. So if 1% of this is true, in the next fight between China and America, we can expect that somebody is going to use nuclear weapons. What can we do? We fight for peace, organize peace movements everywhere. We don't want war, because war, this war, coming big war, will be devastating. We know that. But there are proxy wars continuing everywhere. Just in the what is it called, Myanmar, there is one war. In Middle East, there are wars up and down all the time. Everywhere there are proxy wars, but there is a limit to proxy wars, like Ukraine, where one of the big powers might say, enough is enough. That is what Putin has said 1 week before the war. He said, give me promise that you are not going to take Ukraine into NATO? Nobody said yes. Then he just went in to show his superpowers or whatever cards. So there might be a moment where the second superpowers would say, okay, I see your rest. Then we are in deep trouble. I make jokes to my friends. At least we won't be paying for cremation. That is so serious. It is not a joke.
I want to ask a question. Assume you had a very democratic socialist regime in Russia. Okay? And now you have NATO on the other side, giving all NATO ammunition to Ukraine, including Javelin missiles with nuclear warhead, because that's what the Americans did. Yeah? So what would you do? And you are a socialist democratic president, everybody loves you, you created a fantastic welfare state, you give high wages, you have free education, and these missiles were overlooking, they were aiming at Moscow, your capital, what would you do? I'm asking you, it's a realistic question. What would you do?
I cannot answer that question, but I can just mention one Oksana Dudchak from Ukraine.
Yeah.
She is a socialist. She says these: we, the movement, her movement, will need some time to rethink the conceptual framework of how we are thinking about this world, how we are thinking about the threats which are out there, that the threats are changing, they are developing, and the configuration of reality is already a little bit different than before. Without doing it, there will be no move forward in this moment. So we have to think, we have to use our theoretical abilities without bias. This war has at least created a no bias situation. Where there is capitalism, where there is monopoly capitalism, where there is oligarchic capitalism, there is also imperialism. So there is a fight between elephants, and the donkeys will be beaten. That is how real the situation is. Nobody has power in that respect, but we have the power of creating opposition to our bourgeoisie. It is the book which we have read and we have learned. It is the duty of each and every Marxist to fight against her own bourgeoisie. Now, what happens in Britain now? Wages are decreasing, right? Actually, wages are increasing in amount, but if you take into account the inflation and the cheap labor who is going to be here soon, the wages will be decreasing. And the private equity companies are buying more and more companies. Private equity company for workers like me means pest, cholera, or whatever you call, because they want profit, profit, and profit. Profit by buying, profit by meaning and leaning the company, and profit by selling the company. Nobody cares about workers. I'm working in one of such companies where they won't care at all. And there is the question of migration, reduction of wages and reduction of standards of life for the workers, and migration. And foreign policy, nobody has any control. Can you control your prime minister and foreign minister? No, you can't. They tell whatever they wish, and there is no parliamentary control. We have to create a mass movement against our own bourgeoisies. That is all I can say. But at least we should be discussing the problem everywhere, in each country, every country. If we don't start discussing and debating situations for the working classes everywhere, including refugees and migrants, we don't go anywhere. We should start somewhere. That is the only answer I can give you, Vasilis. Any questions? Any contributions? You have to unmute, Jörn.
Ismail, I was just thinking about what you were saying, the working class, and on the other hand, the equity companies. The equity companies don't bother about the workers. They don't even invest in the production process. They only speculate. That's what you also said. But in this case also, I think it's not the bourgeoisie which is here in the confrontation. It's not the bourgeoisie anymore. Finance capital is a tiny layer of society which is not equivalent to the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is part of the working class to a certain extent. Anyway, they are all wage earners. Part of them also may have shares, but I think this class division doesn't exist in a form that it explains the social movements. Thank you.
Okay. Rajmil, and then Pat.
Right, yeah, I would like to take those points a bit further. I think we mentioned neoliberalism, but neoliberalism is not exactly capitalism anymore. The fact that the financial forces are the ones that count means that production is almost zero in most developed countries anyway, certainly in Britain and the United States, or negligible. And what we're seeing here is that there is socialism, but only socialism of the type of saving the banks, where the state invests on the already rich people. And there has, what I wanted to ask anyone, Vasilis or Bulent, or anyone else, is there has been proposals that we're heading as one of the things that are changing during this Gramsci period into something called neo-feudalism, in the sense that there's very little work in the sense of the Industrial Revolution. People need to be controlled along the lines of manufacturing consent and getting people very occupied. It's a very different type of control where it almost becomes paternalistic, and the real big players are not states anymore, but the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons of this world, who are the new feudal lords, because they not only control our needs, but they control our information. And in many cases, they're eventually going to know us better than ourselves. And once automation kicks in even more seriously, we're going to get these feudal, call them lords or companies or whatever, that are going to control how much we eat, how much we starve, how much we're happy or not, which is a very different set of relationships than simply being a salaried worker. So do you believe in this scenario? Could you comment?
Vasilis or Bülent?
Vasilis, you are mute.
You unmute, Vasilis. He seems to be sleeping.
I think he's frozen actually. More than
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I was saying that the conglomerates that exist around the globe, which perhaps some people call neo-feudal global society. I don't think they would have been possible to.
Vasilis, your internet connection not working properly.
Is that over the last 20 years is that Russia is very much anti-globalist in many respects. It supports all nationalistic movements in Europe. Remember the relations between Putin and Trump? When was the first statement of Trump? When on the 24th of February. Does anyone remember? Does anybody remember?
Putin is genius.
Trump immediately is genius. Yes. He admires Putin. He admires Putin because he is as nationalist as he is, Trump. So they want to Putin and Trump are anti-globalized. They want to bring the state back in a neoliberal fashion. Neoliberalism, we should not confuse neoliberalism with globalization. Neoliberalism regards the domestic environment of the state. Globalization is the global financial capital that has no borders, nothing, and so. The neoliberals are the state. Hayek sent 3 letters to Pinochet supporting Pinochet in 1971 in Chile. Hayek, the guy, the guru of neoliberals, he was very much authoritarian these days. Very authoritarian. We wrote about or using the term neo.
Vasilis, there is problem with your internet connection.
In global capital. The capital is there. Can you hear me now?
Not properly. There is something wrong.
They don't know what's going on. Maybe intelligence services in the field. So, can you hear me now?
Yes, but sometimes you are frozen.
Vasilis, what service are you using? Are you using a Serbian Wi-Fi system? Maybe that's why there is the interference. Or Russian.
Maybe it is Russian internet. That's why.
Can I continue what Vasilis
Yes,
started?
please. You continue
Okay.
until
Well,
he comes back.
I think Vasilis and I have written about these, what Rahmil mentioned. I think we were writing for the last 20 years. We published 3 books, and in every single one, we are talking about this phase of declining U.S. and Western capitalist systems. But this decline is a very long and painful process. It's not like just immediately something will replace it. And one important phase of this decline is what we call as financialization, what the political economists call financialization. And financialization is not something, a new and improved phase of capitalism, but financialization in a simple sense, this is how I explain to my students, it is an illness of capitalism. When capitalism couldn't provide enough high rate of profit in general, then the capital moves away from the productive sector and then start using itself in financial speculations. in the buying and selling the shares and financial markets, and buying and selling currencies, and just you all must have seen these kind of programs, or even there are fictional films about this. Let's say someone has a huge capital, and rather than using it in establishing a factory or a workshop or producing something, because the profit rate was not high enough, then just took it away and established a financial company, and then employed a handful of financial experts. And these people every day and night just sit in front of computers and watch which shares going up, which shares going down. And they make these calculations, buy the shares when they are cheap and sell them when they are high. So this creates a huge amount of profit. But as you can see from a Marxist perspective, they don't create anything valuable. They don't create any value. This is just a speculation. So this financialization from probably 1980s onwards has started to be more and more significant in most of the majority of the Western capitalist societies. And as a result of this, the share of the productive sector gets smaller and smaller. So I think this is where we are now. So majority of the capital are now invested in the financial sector, in financialization. So productive sector is getting smaller, financial sector is getting bigger. And maybe a small number of individuals, the equivalent of the Russian oligarchs, in the Western societies, making huge profits from this exercise. But the wider economy is suffering because this money is not going to be invested in productive sectors, it is not going to create any new jobs. So therefore, this is an illness. And this illness is getting worse and worse. So I think this is part of the reason why there is this inter-capitalist competition and rivalry. And we know from the previous cases, as Pat mentioned, this like 1914 case, this led to real serious military antagonism, and the wars, the world wars emerged as a result. And only after that the situation was solved, and then the capitalism getting new blood, and then continued after that. Now I think we are in that situation. The system is kind of blocked. So there is a block, and in a way, this fighting was a test of this. Now, I mean, we are all saying that yes, it is good that Western governments, American government, are not putting the are not using their aeroplanes, or are not banning the Russian aeroplanes from the Ukrainian space. But I think it's a matter of time. I mean, I'm not very confident about that, because probably they are measuring now to see what will happen next. And that stage may come at some point, because everything moved in this direction from 1991 onwards. It's not a happy and productive period, but at the same time, as again I think Pat mentioned, the China is the real player, because what matters at the end of the day is the economy. What matters for the states, what matters for the powers, and what matters for every single one of us is the economy at the end of the day. And Chinese economy is now growing and getting bigger and bigger. And majority of the things, mainly significant things in the world, are more and more produced by the Chinese individuals, Chinese companies. So this is the main thing. So that is why, for instance, until recently, China was the essential target. That's why the early 2000s so-called war on terror was replaced by campaigns against China, and now campaign against Russian President Putin and Putin's plans. So I think we are at a very, very dangerous and risky situation. I agree with the speakers so far mentioned about this, and I agree with Ismail that there is only one thing we can do. There is only one thing, which is fight for peace and campaign against war. So anti-war fight is the most significant fight now, more than anything else. Just mobilize as many people as possible and join all those peace movements, anti-war movements. there isn't any more urgent time in my lifetime than today for this. Thank you.
I just want to add one more information actually, which I read today. Russians have been sanctioned all over, and they are being more and more sanctioned as well. But we haven't seen the reverberations yet. Now, Russian airways companies have leased over 600 European or Western airplanes. Over 600. Now, the problem is that the European companies or Western companies are asked not to give any spare parts. Airplanes need spare parts even after every flight. Now, most of these 600 leases goes to Irish companies. So, no insurance. There is no insurance when the airplanes are sanctioned. Insurance companies won't insure any airplane. So there is a huge crisis looming around at least Ireland. We know that it is coming very, very soon, because those airplanes, if one of them falls, then it is hundreds of millions of pounds for the companies who have leased those airplanes. So there are many other things like that, and there are problems with the metals, nickel and palladium metals, which Russians usually supplied. They won't be supplied at all. There is the problem there. And food, imported food, there are problems everywhere. They have already started in other countries as well. So there is a big danger of world trade stopping at certain intersections. I don't know. If I don't know this, I don't know anything at all. If trade stops, there is war. So we are in very, very dangerous, crossroads, let me say. If they continue to sanction more, if, for example, China is included somehow in these sanctions, then we are in very, very deep trouble. That is all I can see as far as I know. That is the anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist struggle should be raised by the workers of each country. If they understand it or not, I don't know, but they must do something. That is the only answer bourgeoisie understands. So it will take some time before working classes everywhere take a stand against wars. Well, we'll see. I don't have anything else to say. Are there anybody else making a contribution or asking a question? If not, we are already over 2 hours. I intend to give last words to Bülent, and then ask once more, then I will close the meeting. By the way, Vasilis have had internet problems. He was kicked out of the internet line, he says. He is apologizing. He is very sorry, but he can't come back. Yes, Bülent, the last words are yours as speaker.
And just very briefly, I think we spoke and we told almost all what can be said right now. And the main thing is, yes, this current war, the key person responsible, the key side is the Putin and Russia. So they are definitely, it's the aggressive war, it's the imperialist war, and I don't see whatsoever if anyone sees any justification of this war. But at the same time, I think we also have to acknowledge the groundwork for this conflict have been prepared by the United States and NATO for the last 20 years, step by step. I just want to finish by again saying something else from the beginning of Brzezinski's book. I mean, that book is so significant, not only as an academic book. He wasn't an academic when he wrote this book. He was an advisor. He was in the administration, and his ideas were taken and still are repeated by the US administration. That's why it is important to understand what he wrote. I mean, he even suggested dividing Russia into a number of territories. If you look at that book, you can see a loosely confederated Russia he suggested should emerge, and the West should pressure and put pressure to make this a reality. And this loosely confederated Russia should be composed of a European Russia, a Siberian Republic, and a Far Eastern Republic. So he was really seriously suggesting that Russia should be divided into three loosely connected or republics, European and Siberian and Far Eastern. So this is not just a conspiracy theory. It's not just a pure speculation of an insignificant academic. This is how the United States administration has been thinking for the last 20 years. So I think it is important, yes, first saying that Putin Russia is definitely aggressive now, and we must be criticizing it, we must be against it, but at the same time, we must also acknowledge the conditions prepared by the United States and NATO. Thank you.
Thank you, Bülent. It is actually duty of each and every academician to pass all that information to general public like us. And I would like to thank to all of you. If there are no more contributions or questions, I will close the meeting. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. See you soon in another meeting. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.